topic today gets submitted to us by S. Beam, who writes, I just read on The Hollywood Reporter that the Predator screenwriters are seeking to take back the rights to the movie by suing Disney, which now owns the IP since the Fox purchase. This particular copyright termination law allows authors to cancel transfers after waiting a period of time, typically 35 years. If they win this, what could it mean for other 1980s movies? Could this be a good thing or a bad thing for those who currently hold rights for older movies? Pretty intriguing. All right, thanks a lot for sending that in, man. And yeah, this is fascinating stuff. Now, normally, most film fans don't care about the legal mumbo jumbo of this, that, or the other thing, but this is actually pretty interesting. The basic idea here is that what are the name of the guys? These two brothers they're the ones who wrote a spec script. All right. They weren't hired to write the script. They wrote a spec script called Hunters, which later turned into Predators. And they sold this script to 20th Century Fox so they could make it into a movie and all that sort of stuff. Here's the thing. Section 203 of the Copyright Law, of the Copyright Act, has a clause that I've never heard of. I've never heard of this clause. We're not talking about public domain issues. Basically, Section 203 says, if you've created a copyright and then you sell it without the proper terms of the contract, after 35 years, you can just take it back.
But what does that mean without the proper terms of the contract?
Let's take a look at that, shall we?
Did you go to law school?
I studied law, yes.
Okay, all right. I thought that in my memory, but you also have lived 1,000 lives, so
right.
I can't keep track of all the different things.
No, I never worked in entertainment law. Like the law I worked in when I was starting out, like when I was clerking, I started out in real estate law, and then I went to personal litigation. And but I never did this sort of stuff. So anyway, but I do know how to read law. So let's go over for a second. And by the way, Dial Dundee sends in a super chat badge. Thank you, man. All right, let's go over. This is what's actually written in the Copyright Act, okay? Section 203 of the Copyright Act permits authors, or if the authors are not alive, their surviving spouses, children, or grandchildren, or executors, administrators, personal representatives, or trustees. Basically, what this is saying is that, let's say your great-grandfather wrote Mickey Mouse. That's a bad example. There's actually...
Gone with the Wind.
Let's say Gone with the Wind. And they wrote a spec script, sold it. But your grandfather's passed away, and your parents passed away. You actually still have a claim to this, which is actually pretty interesting. But anyway, so personal representatives or trustees, to terminate the grants, let's start this from the beginning. Section 203 of the Copyright Act permits authors to terminate grants of copyright assignments and licenses that were made on or after January 1st, 1978, when certain conditions have been met. Notices of termination may be served no earlier than 25 years after the execution of the grant, or if the grant covers the right of publication, no earlier than 30 years after the execution of the grant, or 25 years after publication under the grant, whichever comes first. However, termination of grant cannot be effective. Effective in law basically means this is when it actually happens.
Okay.
Termination of a grant cannot be effective until 35 years after the execution of the grant, or if the grant covers the rights of publication no earlier than 40 years after the execution of the grant, or 35 years after publication under the grant, whichever comes first. Now, there is a million caveats and subsections and all this kind of stuff. So basically what's happening here is this. These brothers who wrote this movie, they apparently in 2016, because remember, you can't submit a claim of termination until at least 25 years have passed.
Well, let me just get some clarification here. Just and I might interrupt you as we're going on, and I apologize for that, but I want to make sure that we get everything clear.
Yes.
You said that they wrote a spec script originally called Hunters, which then ultimately became Predator.
They just changed the title.
But the script itself was the script.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they made a spec script and then when 20th Century Fox bought it, it was then rewritten into something else.
To the best of my knowledge, correct.
Okay.
They may have toyed with it or tinkered with it.
But they wrote the script.
Yes.
Okay. They were not hired by 20th Century Fox,
Correct.
but they wrote it on their own. as a spec. And then they brought it to 20th Century Fox and said, what do you think? 20th Century Fox said, we love it. We're going to buy it. We're going to make it. Got it.
Yeah. Now, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about when we say spec, spec is literally short term for speculation. So a spec script, now, normally what happens, or what can normally happen, is a producer has the rights to a certain story and they hire a writer and say, write the script of this story for me, and they pay the writer for their services to write it. A spec script is when nobody has hired you to write a script. It's just up to you. You just take it on yourself. Say, I've got an idea for something, and you write it yourself, and then you kind of shop it around.
It's actually a great way, especially for people who want to break into television. True story, Stephen DeKnight, who, as many of you know, was the showrunner for Spartacus. That's how he actually broke into the world, the Joss Whedon world. He was a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He wrote a spec script for an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. His agent at the time was like, yeah, Joss Whedon's never going to see this. Somehow, I don't know how, because most people will not accept unsolicited scripts, but somehow he got the script in front of Joss Whedon. Joss Whedon said, I loved your spec. Would you like to come and like hang out in the writer's room? And got to know each other. And the next thing you know, he was hired as a writer on Buffy and then Firefly, and the rest is history. So I have heard that writing a spec script for an existing television show is often a better way to get your foot in the door versus writing a pilot and trying to
actually Ronald D. Moore, of my all-time favorite television show, Battlestar Galactica, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Robert Meyer Burnett would know the answer to this better, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ronald D. Moore wrote spec scripts for Star Trek The Next Generation. And that's how he kind of got discovered. So yeah. I'm not saying it happens all the time. It certainly doesn't, but it is one of the avenues to get in. At any rate, these two guys write this spec script. They sell it off. Now, apparently, there's a clause. So in 2016, which is well after 25 years, which is 25 years, I should say, after they sold the license, and 25 years is when you are legally allowed to first submit a notice of termination that will become effective after 35 years. So they submitted it in 2016, and Fox never responded to it. They never responded to it. They never objected, nothing like that. And it wasn't until earlier this year or last year, once Disney got their hands on it, that they started to refute it. And now Disney is going to try to fight this. They have now filed a countersuit. What's interesting here, now I will let you guys, this is a great article on this over at Deadline. Just search Deadline, Disney lashes back at original Predator scribes. Search it on Google, read this whole article. But the basics of it is this. Disney's not saying they're not allowed to take this property back. Disney is basically using the foundation of those guys didn't properly submit the termination notice. So therefore we get to ignore the termination notice, according to law. So that's kind of their pushback right now. Is they're trying to claim that they should be able to just keep it because they're saying that the plaintiffs did not submit the termination notice properly. It's really intriguing. There's a lot of different little legal loopholes in law, obviously. But instead of going in depth into this particular incident, what makes this fascinating to me is the entire entertainment world is going to be watching this story. Because if this holds up, and if these guys are able to just take back their Predator IP, and Disney already has plans to do new Predator. If they're able to take that back, then a lot of studios are going to be getting their legal teams to go through every single movie they've ever made and say, did we pay for this movie to get made, or did we buy a spec script, and where are we in trouble, where are we not? It's just going to be really interesting. It could turn the whole thing on its head. Now, of course, what I think there is a 95% chance of happening here is that this never actually goes to trial. I believe Disney will probably give the lawyers for these guys a call and say, here's 20 million bucks. Go away. Never talk about this again. And there'll be like some undisclosed settlement, and the dudes will go, cool. And they'll walk off into the sunset. So I think that's probably most likely. Well, that's what happens to 95% of all litigation, by the way. But it's going to be very interesting to see how this turns out. Aaron, as somebody who works in the industry, Like, I gotta say, I have never even heard of Article 203 of the Copyright Act. I've never even heard of it until this thing came along. So what was your reaction to it, and what do you see as maybe being some of the ramifications?
Well, as soon as I started reading Article 203, I just thought to myself, this is why I'm very happy that I have a lawyer,
Yes.
because there, you know what, I know where my special skills are, and I know where my limitations are, and legalese is not a language that I speak very well. I'll be the first person to admit that. But that being said, I guess immediately after that thought, I wondered, well, to what end? Like, what is the purpose? If you are the writers of the spec script, is it that you've seen how, this script that you wrote a million years ago, well, I guess in this case, 35 years ago, that you were certainly paid what probably sounded like a lot of money at the time, but then you've seen your baby go off and make so many people that you don't even know all this money. And now you're, at a point in your life where you're going, hey, it would have been really nice to be able to continue to cash in on this thing that the studio has certainly cashed in on. And I'm imagining that they did not have some sort of clause in their original contract that said, okay, we're going to sell you this script, but then we're also going to get, a percentage on the back end of of what it makes. And then if there's ever any spin-offs or ever any sequels, we're also going to get spin-offs of that, percentages of that. I'm assuming that these writers have not seen a dime since that original sale, because had they been receiving back-end points in perpetuity for the lifetime of the property, I don't see this as being an issue. So you're absolutely right. If someone sold a spec script and they got paid, say, $100,000.
Right.
And then that movie went on to make hundreds of millions of dollars, if not over $1 billion, over the course of that property's lifetime, with the sequels and the Alien versus Predator, et cetera, I'd be pretty darn pissed about my little, measly $100,000. That being said, you also have to really, in order for you to have a case against a behemoth company like Disney, you better make sure that you've got something, that you've got a really good case. And I agree with you. I cannot imagine that that this is going to be a case that that Disney's going to lose. Number one, because they have the lawyers, and they could literally keep this. They could keep this in court or in litigation until the grandchildren of the writers of Predator have had grandchildren.
Well, there was a similar case involving the same two lawyers. There was a long-standing case between Warner Brothers with the Superman property and the families and descendants of the creators of Superman who were trying to get the rights back. And the same two lawyers involved in the two sides of this Predator case were the same two lawyers on opposite sides in there. And that thing stretched out forever. But if you're Disney,
what was the ruling in the Superman case?
Ultimately, that one went back. Warner Brothers won that case, but it was kind of a separate thing. It was a kind of a different issue. But if you're Disney, you got to ask yourself, yes, we have this legal army. How much is it going to cost us to drag this legal army over a 7-year court case? And at what point do we go, it'll be 85% cheaper for us just to pay these guys off?
Well, yes, I think they're 100%. Like, I actually have a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and we were talking we all know lawyers, but this particular friend was saying the very first action you always take is see if they'll take money. Just offer them an amount of cash, see how much they're willing to be paid for. But if these writers are not willing to just take a big fat check, which in my opinion, take the big fat check, then Disney, it's going to be a drop in the bucket to drag this thing out versus actually letting this potentially play out in court. And on the off chance that these writers win this case against Disney, then that sets precedent.
No, and that's
when not only Disney, but the entire studio system is effed with a capital E.
Yeah, and this is so
Effed.
Warner Brothers, Sony, everybody's in Disney's corner on this. Here's where it's a little bit different. Whereas a lot of the stuff in that Superman case was very nebulous. This one is interesting because it is black and white law. After 35 years, you can terminate copyright and take it back. And that's why Disney, again, I encourage everybody to go and read that article on Deadline, okay? And go and read it for yourself. But Disney's only argument right now just seems to be they didn't follow the proper administrative technicality of submitting the application.
Which leads us to believe that their lawyers are like, technically, they might have a case.
Yeah, this could get very, very, very interesting. So it's going to be cool to see how this goes. Question is, guys, what do you think about this? I'm fascinated by this, even though 95% chance this is just going to disappear into the wind in a very hush-hush, closed-door settlement. Disney will cut a big fat check to these guys, and it will never be spoken of again. But it could come up in other cases moving forward. And that's why after 1978, I guarantee you most studios probably started negotiating when they were buying spec scripts. We want it in the contract that you forfeit all future rights under the Copyright Act to come back and terminate this thing. But it's going to be interesting to find out how many of these movies are out there. Question is, guys, what do you think about this? Are you as fascinated by me? Or do you think legal, blah, 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 yawn? However you feel about it, jump on down into the comment section below and let us know your thoughts. Okay, guys.